Hello, this is Glenn Ellmers, Salvatori Research Fellow in the American Founding at the Claremont Institute, and author of a recent book, The Narrow Passage, Plato, Foucault, and the Crisis of and the Possibility of Political Philosophy, published by Encounter Books. I have with me on audio someone that I've become friendly with online, Lafayette Lee. He's a contributing editor at IM 1776. Has a very large Twitter following because of his insightful commentary on public affairs. He has a background in the American military and knows a lot about strategy and other interesting issues, and has agreed to talk with me about some of the issues raised in the book from a somewhat different perspective. I think broadly sympathetic to Claremont. We're both certainly on the right, but a little bit different, and I thought that would be interesting to have this discussion. Lee, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm honored to be here. Really respect what you're doing. I enjoyed the book, and so I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Great. Thanks. I thought we'd start off just by mentioning a really interesting interview you did in IM 1776 with the great, almost legendary strategist Edward Luttwak, who lives in Chevy Chase, just up the road from where I used to be in DC. And it was full of wonderful insights. You know, Luttwak is such a great strategic thinker, but you touched in several places on some problems in America. And I thought some of the things Luttwak said about our cultural divisions were interesting and the problem of citizenship. But I thought, given that he's not really a philosopher and not really an analyst of domestic politics, some of the things he brought up could serve us better by going a little deeper. And so I want to ask you, since I'm the partisan of political philosophy and you've sometimes written some things sort of leery of theory, which I can appreciate. One of the themes of my book is that political philosophy has done a lot of damage. And in part, we have to study it in part to fix some of the problems that modern philosophy itself has created. So I wonder if you have some just general reactions to that idea.
Yeah, no, I think with what was so interesting to me about the interview with Luttwak is that there are certain things that were taken for granted. And I understand that he's coming at this from a strategic standpoint, but we talked about patriotism, for example, and about how he compared the United States to Israel. This is all prior to the attack, so it's been interesting to watch that. But talked about the fact that on the left and the right, maybe in Israel, that they still rally around the flag, of their country. Whereas here in the United States, there seems to be a severe division between those who'd be willing to fly an American flag and those who would not, who would even think it's ridiculous. I think that speaks to something. He discussed the paradox of American power, where we feel weak and divided at home and very strong abroad. But, as you mentioned, I've always been a little hesitant when it comes to theory, partially because I'm untrained, right? So I fear the unknown, probably. But
okay, fair enough.
But also, I come at this from, I'm a very traditional person, and I also, was in the military, and so there's kind of a balance between history, experience, those kinds of aspects that resonate with me, that feel very safe and secure, something that I can work with. Politics to me, ideally, is a place where we can work on practical solutions, that I can advocate my own interests openly, that I don't have to subscribe to a philosophy or a theory or endorse anything like that, or pursue even anything outside of that. And it seems that someone like Luttwak can, in our conversation, that he does seem to shy away from the theory, but at the same time, I came away also feeling like certain things are taken for granted, that there's something missing. I know that in our discussions, we've had disagreements at times, but they've been productive. But kind of this idea of political philosophy, because I come at it from the perspective that, we've lost so much of the tradition that I subscribe to, right? And I don't know where to go from there. And it seems to me that maybe political philosophy is an answer.
Well, that's what I'm suggesting. And so, I mean, take something that Luttwak and you know something about with your military background, but I think that it would profit from digging a little deeper into what it means. The problem of ideology, right? So you can look at the problem of ideology and even propaganda in a strategic way. This was very clear during the Cold War. It was clear to some degree in the War on Terror. Both sides used propaganda. Clearly, both communism and radical jihad Islamism are forms of ideology. But we now have the problem of ideology here at home too. And I wonder, not to be fishing for compliments, but I wonder if you thought that any of the things I was discussing about, the tension between Hegel's belief in the rational state and Nietzsche's belief in postmodernism, or why Foucault and these other left-wing thinkers from the 80s might be useful today. Did any of that persuade you to take theory and philosophy more seriously for understanding this ideological element in our politics?
No, I can absolutely say it did. Looking at, I don't know how to make sense of this inglorious present that we're living through without consulting that. Something that really resonated with me throughout, and your writings also outside of the book, but are addressed here. The idea of like having this administrative state where everyone's in charge but nobody's in charge. Having how we can feel propaganda, and then at the same time attempt to be rational and rationalize our way through what is a sea of propaganda. How do you make sense of that? Where is truth? I mean, we might have, people can explain it however they want, but I personally feel a need to find truth, to find something to stand on, but I don't know how to muddle through that. And so in the book, I appreciated that a lot of these philosophers, especially in the modern sense, it helped me to understand a lot of this chaos and the tension. And also, I do like that, coming from a very like traditional pragmatic person, I appreciated the fact that, to me, you didn't denigrate the common man, which is often the case with political philosophy and theory, but that you validated the confusion and the concern and kind of added a little bit of dignity back to those of us who are confused.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. One of the curiosities of this strange time that we're living in, which is really only goes back about 100 years, is up until about 100 years ago, when the progressive movement came in and brought German philosophy with them. Up until that time, it had been pretty much widely thought by all statesmen and thinkers that the more educated you were, the better citizen you would be. This was a view held from Aristotle all the way up to Thomas Jefferson, that the educated classes would be the natural leaders of the community, the most responsible, a classical education, a liberal education, which emphasized the connection between liberal in the sense of liber as freedom and liber as book, the connection between education and freedom. That was, a universal opinion. And only within the last 100 years do we see this phenomenon, especially in the last few decades, that the more educated you are, the worse of an American citizen you are, right? The less patriotic you're liable to be, the more antipathy you're liable to have for traditional America. And so, the ordinary people are they are by far the healthiest part of the regime. And so it's not simply patronizing, I think, to put our hopes in that, and because of this strange inversion in which modern education has become ideological and propaganda and an arm, in a way, of the administrative state. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Let me now maybe ask you a question, which is, one of the things I mentioned in the book, and it's sort of a persistent theme of the Claremont School, which we get from Harry Jaffa, is tradition plays an indispensable role. And the founders thought this, and Lincoln thought this, and Jaffa certainly thought that. But it has to be a healthy tradition. And when the tradition comes under attack, and when you have an ever larger, more diverse society with no regard to who's coming in and being citizenship, with no regard to civic education, the hold that tradition has, the grounding that it gives you, becomes dissipated. And I wonder, from the perspective of someone who sort of puts his hopes in tradition, how do you respond to the problem that presents itself when tradition is no longer a reliable guide, no longer has the authority that it used to have?
No, I think this is an excellent question. This is honestly one of the more difficult things I don't know how to work through. I wish I could say that I've successfully resolved this, but this is actually why, and I think this is why I enjoy speaking to folks from the Claremont Institute, why I enjoy reading your responses to an earlier piece I wrote. I appreciate it because this is a real problem. And I think folks on my side of the fence, I feel like we often feel like we're winning an argument by retracing history and by going over, tracing the thought of the founders and showing there's this firm tradition in which they were acting. And I still believe that. The problem of today is I think all of us can agree that that tradition has been so denigrated over time. It has been warped and changed. And the makeup of the social fabric of who we are as Americans, that has changed radically, and I'm not putting a value judgment on that right now. Let's just recognize that that's, I can trace my ancestry back to 1605 here. But there are plenty of people who I served with, right, who were serving the country, who had only been here maybe 3 or 4 generations. And yet I saw them as an equal. I definitely felt like they put my life in their hands. And so, there's these problems that persist. And I often think that my side of the fence I feel like we do have a strong argument on the importance of tradition, right? But I don't know if we always have an answer on where to go from here. And that is why I do think that these conversations are really important. Because even when it comes to something like immigration, I think we can all agree that immigration is a mass immigration is a serious problem that will radically change this country in ways that we can't even comprehend. And naturalization. But I recognize that, immigration and naturalization, even for the founding generation, whereas that would seem so much more restrictive to us today, but it was a radical departure in some ways from the way things were done in Europe. And so there was something different about that. I think that's I think it's important to recognize those things. And so I think where the strongest argument I see from Claremont and from where you're coming from and within this book is that I don't know how many traditionalists have a good argument on where to go from here without it becoming maybe separatism, not in a militant sense, but to separate oneself out from the body politic and to try to almost create something new, right? To become like a remnant. And I think that might be romantic to some folks, but I see that as a practical person as it's almost just nonsensical.
Yeah, I mean, it's the practical question, which is the one that everyone always wants to know. Those of us in Claremont, every time we talk about what we call the crisis of the regime, the very first question is, okay, well, what do we do? And everyone wants a 10-point plan. And I'm sure that's true sort of in your little subsection of the right too. People want to know what to do. And that's not so clear. I mean, by the way, what do you tell people when one of the things I say, and it's just a very short-term practical thing, is try to become more and more self-sufficient. Yourself as an individual, educate yourself, get healthy, get strong, exercise, become less dependent on technology, build strong family bonds, build strong community bonds, so that, if some kind of crisis comes, whether it's a war or a financial meltdown or a crisis in the food chain or the medical supply chain, the more self-sufficient you are, the better off you're going to be. So that's one little bit of practical advice, which really has nothing to do with political theory. But what do you say when people ask you for practical advice?
I definitely echo that same sentiment. I think it's an American tradition, being as self-reliant as possible.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
We wouldn't be who we are without the frontier and how that shaped us in this country. So that's something I take to heart, especially being, a military guy. So I think that's great advice. On an intellectual, maybe spiritual side as well, I'm a husband and father, and like I said, I take family history and my faith very seriously, and so. One of the things I think is very important for those of us who find ourselves like without very much power, but we want to make it through, is I think to become more rooted. And this isn't possible for everyone. Many of us have different occupations that take us away from place. But I think being able to dig into your place, your sense of place, which I feel like this has been lost in modern America. This sense that you belong to a place and to the people in your community around you, and that you have a story and you have a history. I think these things can be bulwarks and strengthening, strengthening to those of us who are, whether it's a natural disaster or whether it's simply that we start feeling despair, given, which is a great point you bring up in your book. But whether we feel those things, I feel like these can be supports. And I know as a husband and father too, I, like you, value our history and our tradition, and I value what it is to be an American as I understand it. And I think keeping that alive, understanding our family history, understanding our place in history, understanding the heroes of the past. Like, for example, my son loves George Washington. And so we do a lot with that, whether it's if we're going to go on a trip up to Mount Vernon or if we're going to read books about his life. I feel like even though it might sound silly to other people, but this helps me to stay rooted and kind of have a historical perspective on where we're at, not to give up the ship. So I don't know if that's like a great answer for a lot of people, but that's been a real strength to my family and I.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's crucially important. Let me come back to something you said about the remnant and sort of lobby a little bit for my position about the importance of having a political theory. I mean, one of the things I think, and so every time I talk about the distant right or the online right or the young right, I always get in trouble because I'm accused of mischaracterizing them. So I don't want to do that. But so since you mentioned the idea of a remnant, and one of the ideas that you often see is just separating, withdrawing, and this shades into integralism, and it gets very complicated. But one of the questions I always have is, there's certainly a racial element in some parts of the right, which you see, and certainly the demonization of white people that the regime is engaged in. I think pretty clearly has the intention of stoking a reaction, right? I mean, the thing that the regime desperately wants is some kind of violent episode that they can paint as racist in order to justify, harsher, more repressive measures. So the question of race becomes very complicated. And I wonder if everyone on the right has really thought this through. And so my big pitch for, say, the founders' constitutional theory, social compact theory, natural rights theory, is it gives us something, it gives us a vessel to put our traditions into. So I sort of wonder, has your view changed at all on the importance of having a political theory? If you were going to reestablish a little remnant somewhere, what would you base your government on?
That's a good question. I think it's difficult because I think theory is useful, and I find a very practical application for it often. So like it's something I explore, but it's something I can also easily set aside. I can move, and I've noticed this with other people, maybe not as educated as people like you, but a lot of my friends and peers, they'll trade theories quite easily. They'll exchange something, they'll find a new book, and they'll start to kind of wrap their thinking around that, and then move to something else. That's not to say I don't think that political theory is important, but that I think I put it down lower on the priority list than I do other things like experience, and even tradition, and even things that might not have a rational explanation, but they are rooted in who I am, my place. I feel like that, even though it's not always a good answer for what creates a better society in this world we live in, it seems that it at least can provide an anchor. Whereas for me, I don't think that I could really put my faith into a theory. I mean, I think you make a very compelling argument that political philosophy we should re-examine it, that it does have value. And I also think it's important for folks from my side of the fence to also understand that this has been mangled so much over time. It's not what we're seeing is not really a reflection of truly what is a value of political philosophy. It's more like we're really seeing a misshapen, reflection of that's not really true to what it was and could be. but I'll admit, I do struggle with that because I find that having a more aspirational, orienting my society, a society that I live in, or even a community around an aspirational project by which we all look and strive, that to me is one of the reasons why we're here. And so I worry about it. It's difficult for me to put my faith and trust into it, if that makes any sense.
No, it totally does. But the problem, Leo Strauss, who is the guy, my teacher in Claremont was Harry Jaffa, and his teacher was Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss gives this whole explanation of how modern philosophy sort of became deranged and really turned our politics inside out. And all of these problems we have of ideological politics comes out of modern philosophy. And again, one of the claims I make in my book is if we're going to understand this and respond to it, we have to engage with it and understand the ideas. And so there is a very natural, as you say, horror or disinclination to get mixed up in all of this stuff because our politics has become philosophized and our philosophy has become political and everything has become ideological. And there's a strong temptation just to step away from that. But another line that Strauss like to say is, it's very hard to walk away from reason, right? And I wonder if the traditionalists give enough credence to, their unconscious or all the ways that they use reason that they don't want to really admit. And if you think about the founding, say, and the social compact theory that they used, in a lot of ways, it's just the rational understanding of human nature and what lessons do we learn from human nature. Their idea of equality didn't mean the radical social engineering egalitarianism of the left. It didn't mean equity. It meant a rejection of the old feudalism and inherited aristocracy and divine right of kings of Europe. And what it meant was, in this country, everyone is going to have the same political rights, and they will take you as far as you can go. And there's not going to be any titles of nobility, and it's not going to matter that your grandfather was a duke or an earl or a serf. And so political equality was a fairly straightforward idea that we're all equally human beings. And unfortunately, all of that stuff has now become contaminated by ideology. But again, just to push you a little bit, do you think that the traditionalists can get by without thinking through some of these rational implications of what a decent politics means that's consistent with human nature?
Yeah, I definitely think we run into an impasse that where, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that some of the problems that we are dealing with today, I don't know how you can resolve some of these things or even attempt to without having to lead with reason, right? Yeah. Because, as we said, a lot of these traditions, as we see that, that have the trappings of tradition, but they're false and they're misshapen and they no longer function. I think that's a real problem. I've often talked with other folks, who agree with me is, in a way we have to sift through the ashes of these, of our inheritance and try to recover living embers. And that can be very difficult. It can also be difficult to decide which of those is what we should take with us, because some things we really can't. Maybe we can put into a ceremonial or look at it in almost a sacred sense, something that we appreciate and value from the past, but can't really be replicated or continued today. And so I concede that, but I do think I worry sometimes, and I do think that in the book, I think you do a good job of explaining how reason doesn't have to be simply the primary only guide. That these things are, of course, they have boundaries. But what I worry about with reason is I worry that it becomes unbounded, that it starts to break free from the constraints that we all live around. It's very easy for people who, like when we talk about educated people who feel a sense of superiority, that they also don't need to really be bounded by these constraints that have bounded all of us, and bound all of us in our daily lives. And I even consulting back to the founding generation is often, even though they vaunted reason and they were able to let go of certain things from the past by using reason as a tool, it didn't become a primary ideal for many of them. And I think that they made that pretty clear. I think, I'm going to butcher this, but I know like Benjamin Franklin has a great quote where he talks about how his reason always kind of tells him what he wants. And he celebrates reason, but at the same time recognizes that it can be misused. It can be deceiving. And that's my biggest fear, though, is that reason is such a sharp tool.
Right.
I don't like it when it is used to cut through very important constraints that we do not appreciate because we are in this really decadent, degraded state that we're in.
Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, I think you're exactly right. And one of the themes I try to emphasize is that the left, in a way, embraces both poles of the problem. On the one hand, it believes, getting this idea from Hegel and the end of history ideology, that we can have the rational state, and the rational state will be run by these trained experts, trained in the academy and the university, given special knowledge, expertise in these various fields of science. And you saw this above all with Anthony Fauci and the idea that the CDC knows better because they're the scientists and they should rule us because they're the experts. And so that's one part of the left's program. But then at the same time, the left is also postmodern, and it derives from Nietzsche, another modern thinker, the idea that all truth is subjective. And so you get crazy things like feminist chemistry and Afrocentric math. And these two things don't go together. And in a way, the left is both rejects reason and abuses it. And my suggestion is that the happy mean is to go back to a common sense understanding of using our reason in a way to understand human nature. But I emphasize that because I think exploiting that division is something that one of the things I wanted to do in the book is to some degree bring the right together and not to continue to litigate the things that we differ on, but really to focus on what makes woke ideology and the left so crazy and so angry, and to point to some divisions that we can exploit. And I think this division between the rule of the administrative experts and the postmodern rejection of rational knowledge is something we can exploit. What do you think about this prospect of focusing on the things that unite us in order to fight the left and looking for these sort of chinks in their armor that we can focus on?
Well, I completely agree with you there. I think that there are many opportunities. There's a massive amount of terrain being opened up right now where I think that looking at the United States, we do have a very visible center. We have a center that is slow moving and has been mostly captured by the left. So those of us on the right often find ourselves in this really difficult place where the center doesn't really need to appeal or use us in any way because there's really no other place for us to go. We're along for the ride and there's not much we can do. But I've seen over and over these opportunities. I think you brought up an excellent one with the incoherence between these two poles. Mm-hmm. I even think, and not to get into too specifics, I will just say as what we're seeing open up between this most recent event with Israel and Hamas, this has opened up another open ground where suddenly we're seeing a split between the institutional center and the street. Mm-hmm. To me, there's a chink in the armor. And where I'm with you on this, and this is where some folks on my side of the fence do get angry with me, so I'll admit this. I'm a practical person. I'm a common man. So I don't see anything wrong with exploiting these divisions with a mutual enemy or a mutual problem, and finding common cause with other people who are on my left and right in this corner. So I do think it's very important to exploit these things. And I think what is probably the most important is that we have an opportunity to tell normal people that just want to live their lives in a healthy way. They still believe in these traditions. They still, they love their families. They still have faith. Some of the other things that you identify that kind of just that most people at least can appreciate, that they want to live in a harmonious manner within their society. We have such an opportunity to explain what is happening and to use and to allow these people to have a voice. And that is why I do think it's very important to not get gummed up on some of the things that have divided us a lot in the past. I don't know if you and I will ever agree on the war and some other things. There are some things we might not agree on, but we will find a lot of common ground. And like I said earlier, is that I'm at the point where I recognize that our traditions are in shambles, and it pains me to see. I don't know how we work through this without letting go of some of the old fights and disputes and finding allies and common cause with people that want to bring politics back to the realm of politics, where this actually has usefulness in it, and we actually can advocate for our interests. And that's where I'm in complete agreement. And I think that there's some hatchets that should be buried, but it will be very difficult. I'm a little bit of a renegade in that regard. I think a lot of people who I respect and admire on my side of the fence will not appreciate that, but that's something I do believe.
Well, okay, yeah, good. Thanks. I agree with that. Let me put you on the spot a little bit. you can answer or not answer to the degree I don't want to get you in trouble. So one of the things I think is a little unfortunate, social media has encouraged, in a way, a little bit of adolescent behavior. I completely understand, and I'm thinking more about people that are probably younger than both of us, just based on the fact that you're married and have kids. I'm thinking, more like late teens, early 20s. These younger guys, they've been demonized. They've been told that they're white oppressors. They're disgusted with, I guess it used to be called clown world. I don't know, people still use that word. And so, the way they respond in a way that's natural, especially for spirited young guys, is to be contrarian, right? And so they indulge, and social media makes this possible. They indulge a lot of shit posting and, risque stuff and racist stuff and anti-Semitic stuff. And I think in the long run, that's going to be bad for us. I mean, in part, we've seen a lot of people who've had their supposedly anonymous social media postings exposed, and that's sort of blown back on them. But I also think it develops bad habits, and I think, pointing to, the authors of the Federalist Papers, writing as Publius, used anonymous, but everyone knew who Madison, Hamilton. They only did that in part because they wanted to sort of keep people in the dark about who wrote which papers. But I don't think, shitposting anti-Semitic comments can really be justified by appealing to the authors of the Federalist Papers. So I wonder, do you think this is a problem? Am I just exaggerating this? Because what we're going to need is to develop habits of prudence and political responsibility if we're ever going to get back in power. And I think this sort of undermines that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm somebody who is on I'm anonymous mostly because I do enjoy my private life, but I do have friends and associates that are anonymous because they will get fired. And I don't know, possibly my employer would not like what I say, but we all kind of go about this differently. I've heard arguments that, being transgressive can have some value to it. That's not really my personal style. It's something I don't tend to appreciate as much, but I do think that there is an important value in the sense of we do live in a heavily surveilled state where even questions that need to be sorted out. And when you bring up young guys, I think of this often. I was in the Army, and I find especially with young men, it was really valuable to have a mentor always with these young guys. And these young guys were appalling. They were barbaric. They were poorly mannered, not always housebroken. But it just took a little bit of time and some good mentoring, and they came around. And unfortunately, in the world that we live in, and you brought this up and think it's accurate, is that, these guys can lose everything for a flippant comment.
Sure.
But at the same time, I also think that the process of discovering truth and of finding yourself, being able to develop manners, it's a trial by error a lot of the time. And I'm very sad to see that we live in a state, this is America. It's hard to believe, but that, you can lose everything over a word or, something like that. When in reality, I think a lot of these questions, when it comes to things like old hatreds and bigotries and whether it's anti-Semitism or other things like that, I don't really share any of those things or feelings myself. But I understand the value of being able to approach these questions that do drive bigotries, these misunderstandings. There's a way to work through those. I've seen that work. I live down in the South, and we have a long history with this, right? But there's an understanding that comes from experience, through living amongst other people, through finding common ground, and we're not allowed to do that in this world. And so I think that while I don't agree with many anonymous posters, I don't know if we can find a way out of this if we weren't so heavily surveilled, if there wasn't such a cynical way of dealing with people that disagree or dissent. I wonder if we would even have the kinds of problems that we have when it comes to these things. I find one last point. Sorry
Yeah,
to
sure.
ramble on, but I'll bring this other thing up is that so there's something like there's a lot of old revisionism that gets a breath of life on online from historical events that have been settled, I guess, in the common culture. Some of these things let sleeping dogs lie, really. And then there's other things that might need to be re-examined and re-explored. But the problem is that that's an important process, and that process is not allowed to happen. And like I said before, when it comes to bigotries or hatred, the best way to deal with that is to deal with it head on and to grapple with it. Allow people to make mistakes so that they can learn. I find that there are some people that are beyond hope, but I do think most of these young guys, if we lived in a healthier environment, that they would often come to the same conclusions that they mock and ridicule, but it would be more true, and they would be a lot more useful and healthy if they were allowed to do that.
Yeah, those are all good points. So let me just mention one more thing. We can sort of, since this is at the end of my book, just to, in a way, contradict my own argument from a few moments ago. There's a lot to be said for mockery. And what I think is interesting about Foucault, who I talk a little bit about at the end of the book, is he talks about the way the power structure. So this is Michel Foucault, the French postmodernist who wrote a lot in the 70s and 80s, and I think turns out to have a lot of interest to the right, because he shows, in a way, how to resist the power structure. And he was a man of the left, and when he was writing in the 70s and 80s, he assumed that the power structure was sort of right-wing, free market capitalism, all the big institutions which were more or less conservative. Well, now the tables have turned, and now we're the dissidents, we're in the minority, we're the anti-establishment. And I think Foucault's analysis has a lot of utility for those of us on the right. And he talks about, you mentioned this earlier, the way that the power structure is anonymous, and it insinuates itself into everything, and it co-opts your identity. And so, there is an argument to be made, and I'm sort of on two minds of this, that this sort of juvenile, vulgarity, just mocking the power structure, has some utility. And Foucault, who was, had some pretty extreme sexual inclinations and was very contrarian, and wrote a lot about sex. He might he might have approved of the sort of the vulgar opposition to the power structure. But it's tough because we also want to develop habits of, I think the more censorship becomes a problem, the more we're going to have to think about responding, not just with mockery and vulgarity, but intelligently. Think about the way samizdat literature worked in the Soviet Union, or the way esoteric writing in the past was conducted under repressive regimes. There's a way to do this in a way that might be more effective, but could also be more intelligent than just vulgar mockery. So that's just sort of a reaction to my own question. But does that prompt any thoughts in you?
Yeah, no, I think mockery definitely always has a place, especially the most power. I think when we're dealing with people in positions of power where competence, at least the image, like they have they exude competence. That's a big part of people who are in power in our society today. It's always good with a well-landed blow to be able to ridicule somebody, but in a higher-minded sense that challenges that competence. I think that's incredibly useful. And it's important also to a lot of these people that are doing this, it's almost like the child telling the emperor that he's naked, right? It's the same kind of thing. And so I do think that mockery has a place, but I think the most effective kind of mockery is is some that is higher minded and has like a level of artistry about it, right? And this is where I think like somebody like Nietzsche, that you address Nietzsche in your book quite often, but like I think he's right on the money, is that the creating art, creating culture is incredibly important. And that's really where I'd like to see at least our efforts, is that the mockery turns into a form of art in some ways, or that the way that what we are doing at the same time that we're mocking or ridiculing the powerful, I would like that to be diverting folks to a direction where they're looking for new leaders, for a counter elite, potentially, maybe far down the road. But that is what I would like to see. I mean, the masses, they have to be led. And I think that's something that a lot of us on the right had to realize through the populist uprising that we've all lived through, is that we need competent leaders. We need people to lead us, a viable counter elite. I believe that the best way to cultivate that is through in our own ways, is creating art, challenging those who are in power. It can be through mockery, ridicule, but something higher minded, something that leads other people to something better, something else.
That's very well said. I've thought for a long time that the old sort of country club, chamber of commerce, republicanism was very deficient, because it was always scared of the moral questions. It was always scared of talking about, what does the good life mean? What makes life worth living? Because it thought, well, that's sort of, liberal value stuff, and we don't want to get into that. We just want to talk about lower taxes and less regulation. And I've always thought that the right has made a great mistake. And it's very encouraging to me to see all of this interest. I'm a little dubious about the interest in Nietzsche in particular, but I am very encouraged about the interest in beauty and what makes life worth living, and art and literature and music and these things. And I think I put a lot of hope in the renewed interest in that. Last question here. I end my book by rejecting despair, which I say is both a sin and, as I learned from my teacher, Harry Jaffa, an intellectual error, because to despair means that the future has been determined, and I reject a deterministic view of history. I think moral freedom and chance and, frankly, providence will always play a role, and we don't actually know what's going to happen. So we have to simply do our best and trust that God or nature or chance or virtue may interpose and give us unexpected success. We never know. And I see two further things that give me some cause for optimism. One is, I really do believe that there is transhistorical truth and human nature. And to the degree that the left rejects human nature, its agenda is unnatural. And although it could last for a long time, it will always suffer this defect of being unnatural and contrary to the deepest human inclinations. And that's something that will always be a weakness for it. And because it believes in historical determinism, in a kind of progress, the left believes it's on the right side of history still, it's hubristic and overconfident. And I think that's also something to exploit. So I'm a short-term pessimist. There doesn't seem to be a good glide path back to any old normal America in the near future. But long-term, I'm an optimist. And I wonder if you would share here at the end your own thoughts about what you see for the future. Are you hopeful? Are you cynical? What gives you ground for hope, if any?
It's interesting that you said that about despair, because that's something that really stuck out to me, and I thought about a long time after I read that. I'd never read those remarks about despair, and I never thought about it that way, but it really resonated with me, especially as a soldier. Is that we're never allowed to presuppose that we will be defeated, right? We will always find a way. That is the ethos. So I take that very personally in my own life, even outside of the military, as a husband and a father, as an American. We will find a way. And I also I believe that we do have a lot of reason to be grateful and to be hopeful. And we have so much right all around us. I'm a big advocate in us finding our sense of place. Tending to the garden that is all around us. I mean, we can do this day in and day out. We can completely tune out what's happening on the news, and we can do that. That is something that we can do. It's like digging a trench in your own position. Like, we can dig these fighting positions here and now. Nobody's stopping us from doing this. And while we're doing that, the other side is filled with hubris. The other side is trying to fit a round peg in a square hole, or however it goes, and it's going to fail. So I am also very bullish on the long-term prospect of us as Americans. We're a resilient people, and we have been through so much. We've been forged. We were forged on the frontier. We've been forged through world wars and all sorts of different things, depressions, and we're still here, right? And the things that we believe in, the traditions that we cherish, the beliefs that we have in ourselves and in the destiny of this country, which I believe is blessed. We are still here, and we have so much to be grateful for and work through. And so I share that opinion. I think if anyone finds themselves despairing, I think that they need to do some soul searching, because we have every reason to be hopeful for the future. It just takes a lot more work. It helps us identify our problems, and it helps us develop a sense of piety by recognizing this and by trying to fix it. So, no, I share your sentiments. I think that there's so much to be hopeful for that's on the horizon. This can't last forever, and that's always something I think we need to remember. Those of us on the right, is that these bad things cannot go on indefinitely, right? And we also have agency. So these are two really important things to remember.
Lee, that's very well said. I thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your thoughtful comments. Thank you again, and I enjoy the conversation.